Imagine a candlelit chamber in the Kremlin, its walls damp with centuries of fear. The flicker of torches dances across iron chains, wooden racks, and leather-bound instruments of pain. In the silence, footsteps echo, heavy with authority, as a prisoner is dragged in, accused of treason, heresy, or simply of speaking out of turn. This is not a scene from some medieval Western dungeon. This is Moscow under the Tsars, where justice was entwined with cruelty, and confession was often wrested not through truth, but through torment. The story of torture in Tsarist Russia is not merely about devices and punishments. It is about power, how rulers controlled their people, how the state projected authority, and how fear became an instrument more enduring than iron. To understand Russia's long and troubled dance with torture, we must travel back to the 16th century, to the reign of one of history's most infamous monarchs, Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible ruled Russia with a mixture of brilliance and brutality. He centralized power, expanded territory, and laid the foundations of an empire. But he also weaponized torture as a tool of governance. Under Ivan, torture was not just punishment. It was spectacle. Public executions and brutal interrogations sent clear messages. Defy the Tsar, and the consequences will be written on your body. Instruments like the knout, a heavy leather whip embedded with metal or bone, became symbols of his reign. One lash could tear flesh, several could kill. Ivan's most feared creation was the Oprichniki, a secret police force loyal only to him. Cloaked in black, riding black horses, they swept across towns and villages, rooting out supposed traitors. Interrogations were merciless. Victims were stretched, beaten, and mutilated until confessions spilled forth, whether true or not. This reign of terror was not random cruelty. It was carefully designed. By breaking bodies, Ivan broke wills. By parading punishment, he ensured obedience. Torture became political theater, where the suffering of one was meant to silence thousands. In Tsarist Russia, torture was not a shameful secret. It was embedded in the legal system. Trials often depended less on evidence and more on forced confessions. Judges and officials believed pain could reveal truth, that agony stripped away lies. The Russian legal code of the 17th century, the Sobornoye Lazany of 1649, explicitly permitted torture during investigations. It was codified, normalized, and seen as an acceptable means of achieving justice. Even more, it was hierarchical. Nobles, clergy, and peasants did not suffer equally. For commoners, the lash, the rack, and the branding iron were routine. For elites, punishments were more honorable, though no less painful: banishment, forced labor, or execution by sword rather than rope. One infamous punishment was the batag, thick rods used to beat prisoners across their backs and legs. Sometimes the blows were measured 10, 20, 30. Other times they continued until the victim could no longer stand. For peasants, survival was rare. For the state, the message was unmistakable. Torture in Russia was not confined to hidden chambers. It spilled into public squares, where punishment became theater. Markets, bridges, and city gates doubled as stages of state power. Take the punishment of branding. Criminals were seared with hot irons, often marked with letters indicating their crimes: thief, murderer, traitor. These scars were permanent, visible reminders of both guilt and state authority. Women accused of prostitution or moral crimes were sometimes branded on their faces, ensuring a lifetime of shame. Then there were executions, brutal and inventive. Hanging and beheading were common, but Russia also employed the dreaded breaking on the wheel, where limbs were smashed with iron bars before death. The condemned often lingered for hours, their agony a warning to the watching crowd. Public spectacle was the point. By turning torture into theater, the Tsars reminded their people that disobedience was not simply a crime. It was a fate to be avoided at all costs. Fast forward to the late 17th and early 18th century, and we meet another towering figure, Peter the Great. Known for modernizing Russia, building a navy, and opening the window to Europe, Peter also carried forward the darker traditions of torture. Peter faced constant threats, from rebellious nobles, from the conservative Streltsy Guard, from anyone resisting his radical reforms. And when he punished them, he did so with a severity that shocked even his contemporaries. In 1698, after a rebellion by the Streltsy, Peter ordered thousands of executions. Torture chambers worked around the clock. Rebels were broken on the wheel, impaled, or hanged in rows for all to see. Peter himself was said to take part in some interrogations, wielding the axe or whip to extract confessions. The knout remained a favorite tool of state power, but new punishments emerged. Flogging, mutilation, and forced labor in Siberia became instruments not only of pain, but of exile. Siberia itself turned into a prison without walls, a place where those who survived their punishments were sent to live out their days in frozen despair. Peter's use of torture highlights a paradox. He wanted Russia to embrace European science, culture, and governance, yet he wielded cruelty with medieval ferocity. Reform and ruthlessness went hand in hand, and the body of the condemned remained the canvas upon which the Tsar wrote his authority. Women in Tsarist Russia were not spared from this system of pain. In fact, their punishments often carried an additional layer of humiliation. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or moral transgression were treated with particular severity. Women could be whipped in public markets, their hair shorn as a mark of disgrace. Some were paraded through streets in iron collars, their supposed sins announced to jeering crowds. One infamous practice was the scold's bridle, an iron cage fitted over a woman's head, with a sharp bit pressing down on the tongue. Designed to silence nagging or outspoken women, it was both torture and humiliation, a physical gag and a public shaming. For women labeled as fallen or morally corrupt, the punishment was not only physical but social. The scars, the shaved head, the branded face. These ensured that their suffering outlasted the lash, marking them for life as symbols of disgrace. By the 18th century, torture was more than just a legal practice, it was a cultural reality. Russians grew up watching punishments in markets, hearing tales of torment from dungeons, and living with the knowledge that the Tsar's justice was inescapable. This environment shaped not just individuals but society itself. It bred caution, silence, and submission. When power is enforced through pain, obedience becomes survival. Yet the endurance of torture in Tsarist Russia also reveals another truth. Rulers feared their people as much as the people feared their rulers. By making examples of rebels, dissenters, and criminals, Tsars tried to keep control over a vast, volatile land. Torture was not just cruelty, it was strategy. And while Europe in the 18th century began to embrace Enlightenment ideals, questioning torture as barbaric and ineffective, Russia clung to its darker traditions. The whip, the branding iron, the iron collar, they remained tools of statecraft long after other nations began to move away from them. Imagine being summoned to the Kremlin during the reign of Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. The very walls seemed to breathe menace. The Tsar himself was said to stalk the corridors in dark robes, accompanied by his feared guards, the Oprichniki, clad in black, with severed dog heads and brooms attached to their saddles. These men symbolized both loyalty and brutality. The dog heads for sniffing out treason, the brooms for sweeping away enemies. For those unfortunate enough to be accused, torture was inevitable and survival was rare. The Oprichniki were Ivan's chosen instruments of fear. Their task was to root out dissent and destroy noble families suspected of betrayal. But this was not a clean process of investigation. It was a theater of cruelty designed to remind everyone of the Tsar's absolute power. Victims were paraded through the streets before their torment began, forced to endure humiliation before physical agony. One method they favored was the strappado. A prisoner's hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope, then dropped suddenly, wrenching shoulders from their sockets. It was an imported technique, yet the Russians, under Ivan's guidance, made it their own by adding fire, whips, or even boiling water during the ordeal. Public executions were as much a form of entertainment as punishment. Crowds gathered in Moscow's Red Square not only to witness justice, but also to participate in a ritual of fear. One particularly chilling scene was the slow burning of traitors. Unlike the swift execution by sword, This method forced the condemned to writhe in agony before finally succumbing. Ivan's reign marked a turning point in Russia's use of torture. It became more theatrical, more deliberate, and deeply entwined with political theater. Yet Ivan the Terrible was not the only ruler who used torture as a tool of governance. In the centuries that followed, Russia's Tsars adapted and evolved these brutal traditions. The infamous Secret Chancery, founded under Peter the Great, became the nerve center of interrogation and punishment. Located in Moscow, it was a place few ever left alive. Inside, skilled interrogators combined medieval methods with more modern instruments. Whips, branding irons, and racks stood alongside devices designed to crush fingers or split limbs. Peter the Great himself was no stranger to torture. Obsessed with modernizing Russia, he also ruled with a ruthless hand. When he suspected his own son, Tsarevich Alexei, of conspiring against him, he ordered the young man's arrest and torture. The story spread across Europe. A son bound, beaten, and broken in the name of loyalty to the empire. Though Alexei died during his imprisonment, many historians argue that it was the interrogations, personally overseen by Peter, that sealed his fate. For Peter, modernization required not only new ships and science but also the complete submission of his people to his will. By the 18th century, torture had become an institutionalized practice. The Secret Chancery operated quietly, gathering confessions from nobles, soldiers, and peasants alike. Its methods varied depending on the social class of the accused. Nobles were sometimes spared the more degrading forms of torture, while peasants bore the brunt of physical torment. This reflected the rigid hierarchies of Russian society. Punishment itself became a mirror of status. One infamous device was the knout, a heavy leather whip weighted with metal. Strikes from the knout did not simply bruise, they tore flesh, often leaving victims crippled or dead after just a few blows. Sentences could range from 20 to 100 lashes, but even 20 was often fatal. Unlike in Western Europe, where the rack or the wheel were dominant, in Russia the knout became the ultimate symbol of the Tsar's wrath. Travelers to Russia in the 18th century often wrote of their horror upon witnessing its use. It was not simply punishment, it was annihilation disguised as law. Alongside physical torture, humiliation was a powerful weapon. Women accused of immorality, witches or so-called fallen nuns could be paraded through villages in iron collars, their heads shaved and faces smeared with ash. These spectacles reinforced moral codes while degrading the accused. Public shaming was often more lasting than physical wounds, for it destroyed reputations and isolated victims from their communities. The Orthodox Church played a complex role in these practices. On one hand, it preached mercy and salvation. On the other, it sanctioned brutal punishment for those deemed heretical or disobedient. The church courts sometimes collaborated with the state in interrogations, using torture to extract confessions of heresy, sorcery, or dissent. The alignment of faith with brutality gave Russia's torture system a sacred justification. To resist the Tsar or the Church was to resist God himself. By the 19th century, the winds of change began to stir. The Enlightenment in Europe had already sparked debates about the morality and effectiveness of torture. Russia, though slower to adapt, eventually began to feel these pressures. Catherine the Great, for instance, publicly criticized torture and introduced reforms aimed at curbing its use. Yet even under her reign, exceptions persisted. Rebellion, treason, or threats to the crown often reopened the door to torment. The Decembrist Revolt of 1825 is a telling example. When noble officers rose against the autocracy, they were swiftly crushed. Interrogations followed, and though the official record muted the details, whispers of torture circulated widely. The state needed to send a message. Dissent would be met with merciless retribution. Still, by the late 1800s, Russia officially banned torture. The Secret Chancery was dissolved, and more modern judicial systems were introduced. Yet, even as the empire sought to modernize, echoes of the old ways lingered. The knout disappeared from official law, but its memory remained vivid in Russian culture. For many peasants, stories of the knout, the burning stake, and the iron collar lived on as warnings passed down through generations. It is here that we must pause and reflect on the deeper purpose of torture under the Tsars. It was not merely about punishing individuals, it was about shaping society. Fear was a currency, one that rulers spent freely to maintain control. Every public execution, every shriek from a darkened cell, reminded the masses of their place in the order of things. And for centuries it worked. The Russian Empire expanded, its people subdued, its rulers both feared and obeyed. But fear is a fragile foundation. When the great revolutions of the 20th century erupted, they did so in part because the old methods of control had eroded trust. The torture chambers of the past had left scars, not only on bodies but also on collective memory. The legacy of torture under the Tsars became part of the narrative that fueled rebellion and demanded change. Today, when we walk through Moscow or St. Petersburg, the grand palaces and cathedrals tell one story of glory, empire, and faith. But beneath those gilded domes lies another story, darker and less spoken. The prisons, the secret chancelleries, and the execution grounds are harder to find, yet their shadows linger. They remind us that history is not only built on triumphs but also on terror. To study this hidden side of Russia's past is not to sensationalize cruelty, but to understand the mechanisms of power. Torture under the Tsars was not random violence. It was a carefully curated system designed to reinforce authority, punish dissent, and display the might of the state. By examining it, we glimpse the psychology of rulers who believed fear was the strongest bond between them and their subjects. As we close this journey, remember this: the story of torture in Russia is not just about pain and punishment. It is about the fragility of human dignity under systems of absolute power. It is about the tension between fear and obedience, faith and cruelty, tradition and change. And most of all, it is a reminder that even in the most gilded of empires, shadows can run deep. History does not forget. The cries of the tortured, though long silenced, echo still in the corridors of Russian memory. To listen is to learn. To remember is to resist. And to resist is to ensure that such darkness does not return.